I spent 32 years paying for that house on Willow Creek Drive. 32 years. And somehow, in less than 2 weeks, my own family found a way to make me a prisoner inside it. Not with chains, not with violence, with paperwork. You ever notice how betrayal rarely arrives screaming? Most of the time, it walks in quietly, carrying a folder and smiling at you across the kitchen table. What Brandon didn't understand was this. I spent 40 years uncovering financial fraud for a living. People lied to me every single day. And eventually you learn to recognize greed the same way farmers recognize a storm coming over Iowa fields. The funny part, he thought I was the easy target. He only realized how wrong he was after my business partner walked through that front door. Before we get into this, tell me where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? And if you enjoy real stories about family betrayal, quiet revenge, and hard-earned justice, go ahead and subscribe. You're going to want to stay for this one. That Tuesday started like every other Tuesday in my life. Quiet, predictable, comfortable. The kind of morning you don't appreciate until somebody tries to steal it from you. I woke up at exactly 6:12 a.m. because my body had apparently signed some lifelong contract with routine back in 1987. Didn't matter if it was snowing, raining, or the middle of July in Iowa with humidity thick enough to chew. My eyes opened at 6:12, every single time. I shuffled into the kitchen wearing my old gray thermal shirt and flannel pajama pants with tiny fishing boats on them. Margaret used to hate those pants, said they made me look like a retired camp counselor. Now I wore them out of spite and nostalgia equally. The kitchen smelled faintly like cinnamon from the rolls my neighbor Mrs. Patterson had dropped off the night before. I stood there barefoot on the cold tile floor while the coffee maker hissed and sputtered like it was fighting for its life. Outside the window, Willow Creek Drive looked peaceful. Mailboxes lined up neatly, wet sidewalks from overnight rain, a teenager jogging with headphones too big for his head, an old golden retriever dragging its owner down the street like it paid the mortgage. Normal life. That's what makes betrayal so dangerous, by the way. It almost always arrives in the middle of ordinary moments. I poured coffee into my favorite dark blue mug, the chipped one Sammy always threatened to throw away, and sat at the kitchen table under the yellow hanging light Margaret picked out 20 years ago at a Home Depot in Cedar Rapids. You know the kind of light I mean. Ugly during the day, cozy at night. I was halfway through reading the sports section when my phone buzzed across the table. Brandon. Even seeing his name pop up gave me a strange feeling in my stomach. Not fear exactly, more like instinct, like hearing a smoke detector chirp once in the middle of the night. "Morning, Warren," he said after I answered. "Now pay attention to this next part. People tell you who they are with tone long before they do it with words." Brandon sounded cheerful. Too cheerful. The kind of cheerful salesmen use before explaining why your transmission mysteriously isn't covered anymore. "Morning," I replied slowly. "You calling to finally apologize for putting diesel in my lawnmower 3 summers ago?" He laughed. Forced. Tight. That told me more than the words did. No. Actually, I wanted to stop by later with some paperwork." Paperwork. See, I spent 40 years as a forensic accountant. Most people hear that and imagine calculators and boring spreadsheets. No. What I actually did was investigate fraud, embezzlement, hidden assets, fake signatures, financial manipulation. I spent decades sitting across from nervous people pretending they weren't lying while sweat gathered around their collars. You learn things in that profession, tiny things. How greedy people rush, how dishonest people oversell confidence, how liars always explain too much. And Brandon explained too much. Just updating some estate planning documents, he continued quickly. Making things easier for the future. You know, protecting the house. Protecting the house, funny phrase, especially considering what he was actually trying to do. I leaned back slowly in my chair. "Well," I said, "that sounds exciting. Nothing gets my blood pumping like legal documents before breakfast." Another fake laugh. Then silence. Brief, but noticeable. "You'll be home around noon?" he asked. "Probably." Perfect. The call ended. I sat there staring at the phone for another 10 seconds while the coffee cooled in my mug. Then I looked toward Margaret's framed picture near the counter. And I swear to God, sometimes I could almost hear her voice. That little warning tone she used whenever she thought someone was full of nonsense. Don't start trouble, Warren, I smiled to myself. Too late, sweetheart. Around 8:30, I drove my silver 2011 Ford Explorer down to the Maple Bean Cafe on Locust Street. Every Tuesday, Sammy Jenkins and I met there for coffee and what we lovingly referred to as professional complaining. Sammy was already sitting outside under the striped awning when I arrived. 63 years old, balding, thick glasses, denim jacket no matter the weather. He looked like every high school football coach who'd ever yelled at a referee. "You look terrible," he said as I sat down. "That's because I'm aging naturally." "No," Sammy replied. "That's stress face." I laughed. "Stress face?" "Yeah. Your left eyebrow does this weird twitch whenever somebody's trying to screw you financially." "You know what's disturbing?" I said. "You might actually be right." The waitress brought our coffees. Sammy ordered one of those complicated caramel drinks that sounded like a scented candle flavor. I drank plain black coffee because I believe suffering builds character. I told him about Brandon's call. Every word. Sammy listened quietly while stirring too much sugar into his drink. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You think he's after the house?" "I don't think," I replied carefully. "I notice. There's a difference. And something about this smelled wrong. You ever walk into a room and immediately know someone was arguing before you got there? That's how financial fraud feels to me. Invisible tension, patterns out of place. Sammy scratched his beard. "You gonna confront him?" "Nope." "Why not?" "Because impatient people destroy themselves if you give them enough time." That made Sammy grin. "There he is," he said. "The old bloodhound." See, that was my reputation back in the day. At the firm, they called me the Bloodhound because once I smelled inconsistency in financial records, I never stopped digging. One guy in Omaha hid $200,000 through fake construction invoices for 3 years. Took me 48 hours to catch him. Brandon didn't know that version of me very well. To him, I was just Warren, quiet old guy. Gray sweaters, hardware store coupons, bird feeder in the backyard. That was his first mistake. Underestimating calm people. Around 11:47 a.m., I pulled back into my driveway. Brandon's black BMW X5 was already parked outside the house. Of course it was. The man couldn't arrive anywhere without looking like he was auditioning for a luxury watch commercial. I walked slowly toward the front door carrying a small bag of cinnamon rolls from the cafe. Because here's something I need you to understand about me. I refuse to enter stressful situations hungry. That's just wisdom. Inside, Brandon stood near the dining room table wearing a navy button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled perfectly halfway up his forearms. Lawyer posture, salesman smile. And sitting neatly in front of him, a thick stack of papers. Red tabs, yellow sticky notes, signature lines waiting patiently like loaded traps. "Hey, Warren," he said warmly. Too warmly. "Thanks for doing this." I looked at the documents, then at him, then back at the documents again. And right there, before I even touched a single page, I noticed the first mistake. Tiny, almost invisible, but enough to make the little alarm bells in my head start ringing, slowly, quietly, dangerously. And that's when I realized this wasn't about helping me at all. This was about control. Now, if you've never worked in fraud investigation before, let me explain something. Real scams rarely look dramatic in the beginning. No dark alleys, no whispered threats, no villain petting a cat in a leather chair. Most fraud starts with paperwork sitting politely on a dining room table beside a bowl of decorative fruit nobody actually eats. That's exactly what I was looking at. The bowl still had fake apples Margaret bought from Target sometime around 2011. One of them had a dent in it because Brandon dropped it during Thanksgiving and tried to pretend he hadn't. Funny what your brain remembers during moments like that. Brandon pulled out a chair for me. Too helpful. That's another thing dishonest people do. They suddenly become incredibly polite when they need your signature. "Go ahead and sit down, Warren," he said. "I already highlighted the important sections." Highlighted. That word alone nearly made me laugh. I sat slowly, setting the cinnamon rolls beside me while pretending to adjust my glasses. In reality, I was studying him. Brandon looked confident but not relaxed. Big difference. His right knee kept bouncing under the table. Tap, tap, tap. Impatience. That's greed's favorite symptom. He slid the papers toward me. It's mostly procedural, he explained quickly. Power of attorney adjustments, asset protection, just making things easier if your health declines later. There it was. Health declines. You know that feeling when somebody tries to gently insult you while pretending they care about you? That. I flipped open the first page carefully, calmly. Inside the documents looked professionally prepared. Legal formatting, official stamps, dense paragraphs designed to exhaust older people into blindly signing. But Brandon forgot something important. I used to build cases against people smarter than him before my second cup of coffee. My eyes moved line by line, and within 30 seconds I found mistake number 2. The property transfer clause referenced a revised county filing code that had been discontinued 18 months earlier. Most people would never notice that, but I noticed because I'd spent 20 years auditing real estate fraud cases across Iowa and Nebraska. Some habits never leave you. I looked up slowly. Where'd you get these prepared? Brandon smiled too fast. Margaret Cole handled it. Margaret Cole. Now there was a woman who treated ethics like optional seasoning. She was one of those suburban attorneys who advertised during daytime television between reverse mortgage commercials and arthritis medication ads. I once saw her defend a man who tried to classify his fishing boat as a religious expense. True story. I nodded slowly. Margaret's still practicing. She's very respected. Oh, I'm sure she is, I muttered. Brandon missed the sarcasm entirely. That's the problem with arrogant people. They're usually too busy admiring themselves to detect danger. He leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly. Look, Warren, this is really about protecting everyone. The house, the finances, making sure things stay stable. Stable. Interesting word choice considering he was trying to quietly take control of everything I owned. I turned another page. And there it was, the real trap. Buried deep inside page 14 under a mountain of legal jargon sat a residential competency clause. If signed, it would effectively allow Brandon temporary authority over my finances and housing decisions under the justification of future cognitive concerns. Future cognitive concerns. In plain English, they wanted legal groundwork to keep me dependent inside my own house while slowly taking control of the estate. I leaned back in my chair. Not angry yet. That's important. See, younger people think power comes from explosive reactions, slamming tables, raising voices, threatening lawsuits. No, real power is staying calm while the other person unknowingly walks into a trap of their own making. And Brandon. He was halfway inside it already. You okay? He asked carefully. I looked at him for a long moment. You ever notice how legal documents use 20 unnecessary words to say one ugly thing? He laughed nervously. That's lawyers for you. Mm-hmm. I kept reading, and then I found the funniest part of the entire situation. The absolute dumbest mistake greed had convinced him nobody would notice. The witness timestamp on one signature page showed the document had supposedly been reviewed 3 days before the date printed on the filing draft. Impossible timeline, meaning somebody rushed, meaning somebody got sloppy, meaning somebody underestimated the old man in the gray sweater. I almost smiled right there. Almost. But instead I rubbed my chin and pretended confusion. Now stay with me here because this next part matters. Sometimes the best way to expose a liar is to make them believe you're weaker than you are. So I sighed heavily and took off my glasses. A lot of complicated stuff here, Brandon. His shoulders relaxed immediately. There it was. Confidence. Premature confidence. The important thing, he said gently, is making sure you're protected. Protected. I swear dishonest people love that word almost as much as politicians do. I looked down at the papers again while my mind quietly connected dots. Property clauses. Authority transfer language. Accelerated review signatures. Outdated filing references. This wasn't just manipulation. This was rushed manipulation, and rushed people make mistakes, big ones. I glanced toward the kitchen clock, 12:26 p.m. The old silver wall clock Margaret insisted on keeping even though it ticked loud enough to sound like a bomb countdown in quiet rooms. Tick, tick, tick. Funny enough, that's exactly what it felt like. Brandon stood up suddenly. You know what? Take your time reviewing everything. I'll make us some coffee. The moment he walked into the kitchen, I grabbed my phone beneath the table and snapped 3 quick photos of the signature pages. Click, click, click. Old age teaches efficiency. By the time he returned carrying coffee mugs, my phone was already back in my pocket. He handed me the cup carefully, still taking it black. Like my sense of humor, I replied. That actually made him laugh genuinely for the first time all afternoon. And honestly, that almost made the situation worse, because moments like that remind you betrayal rarely comes from strangers. It comes from people who know exactly how you take your coffee. We sat there another 20 minutes, pretending this was a normal family discussion, while underneath the surface, both of us were playing entirely different games. Brandon thought he was managing an old man. I was building a timeline. Huge difference. Eventually, he stood near the doorway, adjusting his expensive watch. Rolex, silver face, probably cost more than my first car. Just let me know when you're ready to sign, he said. I nodded slowly. Oh, I will. And I meant that. Because by then, I already knew 2 things for certain. First, Brandon wasn't acting alone. Second, whoever helped him believed I was already too old, too distracted, or too emotionally broken to notice what they were doing. That was their fatal mistake. After he left, the house became quiet again. Too quiet. I stood in the kitchen holding my coffee while rain started tapping softly against the windows. Iowa weather has terrible timing like that. Always dramatic when you least need it. I walked back to the dining room table and stared at the documents again. Then I noticed something else. Tiny, almost invisible. An email address printed near the footer of one draft copy. Not Margaret Cole's law office. A private financial consulting firm downtown. And suddenly the entire thing got much bigger, much uglier. I picked up my phone and called Sammy immediately. He answered on the second ring. Well, he asked. I looked at the paperwork spread across my dining room table like a crime scene. Then I smiled for the first time all day. Sammy, I said quietly, I think our boy just made a very expensive mistake. By the time Sammy arrived that afternoon, the house already felt like a war zone. Not with bullets, not with shouting, but with paper. Stacks of documents lay on the dining room table, all neatly aligned, yet each one screamed danger. Red tabs, yellow sticky notes, one folded page tucked under the others. I stared at them while sipping coffee that had long since gone cold. Sammy grinned when he walked in. Looks like someone's been busy. Busy or betrayed, I replied. He raised an eyebrow. Which one? Both, I said, setting my mug down carefully like handling evidence. We sat, quietly, watching, studying. The sun streamed through the windows, shadows stretched across the hardwood floor. Brandon had underestimated me. Of course he had. Greedy people always do. They think patience is a weakness. They think experience means tired bones. They think a quiet man can't notice when someone's moving the pieces behind his back. He was wrong. I started with the first document. Clean lines, professional formatting, almost convincing. Almost. A tiny timestamp slightly off. A signature line missing initials. A wrong county code. Little things that most people overlook, but I didn't overlook them. That's what 40 years in forensic accounting does for you. You see the cracks before they even exist. Sammy leaned in. Spot anything? Already have I said. He squinted at the page. You're fast. Not fast. Careful. Observant. Patient. That was my mantra. We went through the stack page by page. Every inconsistency, every rushed clause, every tiny oversight was noted. Brandon and Margaret Cole had made a mistake. They assumed I would rush. They assumed I would panic. They assumed I would sign anything to avoid conflict. They forgot who I was. I made a few notations in my own handwriting, tiny arrows circled dates, short comments. Things that would be useful later. Because revenge, like fraud detection, requires preparation, not impulsiveness, precision, timing. We paused at the middle of the stack. Sammy leaned back, stretching. You're enjoying this too much, he said. Enjoying what I asked, though the corner of my mouth twitched. Watching him fail without him knowing it. Observing I corrected. Same thing, really. After another hour, we had a plan forming. I would wait. Watch. Let Brandon think he was winning. He had already shown his impatience that morning. Every email, every call, every text revealed it. He was arrogant, careless, predictable. I walked to the kitchen, pouring another cup of coffee. Rain had started again, tapping against the windows softly, almost like nature was keeping time for me. I stared at the papers on the table. My finger traced a signature line stopping at a date that didn't make sense. Margaret Cole had rushed this. Brandon had rushed this. The combination was poetic. I walked through the living room slowly, letting my eyes drift over the familiar furniture. Each sofa cushion, each framed photo, each dent in the floor from years of life lived, and all of it under threat of being used as a weapon against me. I felt my pulse calm. Betrayal has a way of sharpening your senses. Every sound was louder. Every movement mattered. At 4 p.m., I checked my email. Brandon had sent another message. "Are you ready to sign yet?" I smiled faintly. Patience, Warren. Let him reveal everything himself. By 4:30, the house was quiet again. Too quiet. That's when I walked to the garage. The Ford Explorer waited patiently. Its silver paint dulled slightly in the rain's reflection. I ran my hand over the hood. The car, the house, the papers, they were all pieces of a puzzle Brandon didn't understand. Returning to the dining room, I picked up the stack of documents again. Every clause, every paragraph, every hidden notation was now clear to me. I could see the pattern. Brandon wanted control. He wanted compliance. He wanted me trapped in my own home. And he thought he had the upper hand. I pored over one last file. Then I stood stretching, letting the tension flow out of my shoulders. Sammy looked at me. "You ready?" "For what?" I asked. "The next move," he said. I nodded. "Soon, very soon. Because that's the point of quiet revenge. You don't act immediately. You wait. You observe. You let the arrogance of others push them into the trap themselves." I glanced at the clock. 5:15 p.m., the golden hour. The perfect moment for a patient man to start his next move. I picked up my phone. 3 quick photos of the signature pages. Click, click, click. Evidence secured. And then I put the phone back in my pocket. Brandon was coming. He didn't know what he had unleashed. I sipped the cold coffee, let the rain tap against the window, and waited. Patience, precision, observation. And soon the storm would break, Brandon would make his mistake, and I would be ready. Quiet revenge isn't loud. It's invisible. It's subtle. It's inevitable. And at that moment, I realized how satisfying inevitability could feel. That evening, the rain got heavier. The kind of Iowa rain that turns the street silver under the streetlights and makes every house feel a little more isolated. I stood in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee I had reheated 3 separate times and still forgotten to drink. My eyes kept drifting back to the dining room table, to the papers, to the signatures, to the trap. You know what hurt the most? Not the legal maneuvering, not the attempted manipulation, not even the greed. It was the planning. The fact that Brandon had probably sat somewhere, maybe in his BMW, maybe in Margaret Cole's office downtown, and calmly discussed ways to control me like I was some aging inconvenience instead of family. That part stayed in my chest like a splinter. I walked into the living room slowly. Margaret's old knitted blanket still sat folded over the armrest of the couch, exactly where she used to leave it. The remote control still had masking tape on the back, because she refused to buy a new one after dropping it in soup back in 2017. Soup. Imagine surviving cancer treatments only to lose a fight against tomato bisque and gravity. I smiled despite myself. That's grief for you. It sneaks humor into pain when you least expect it. Around 7:40 p.m., my phone buzzed again. Brandon. 3rd time that day. Impatience. Always impatience. I answered calmly. Evening. "Hey," he said quickly, "just checking in." Nobody says just checking in 3 times in one day unless they're nervous. I'm still reviewing everything I replied. Silence. Then Margaret says it's important we finalize this before the end of the week. There it was again, pressure disguised as concern. I walked toward the kitchen window while he talked. Outside, rainwater slid down the glass in crooked little rivers. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson's porch light flickered on automatically at exactly 7:45 like it did every single night. Normal life continuing while my own family quietly tried to corner me legally. Funny how the world does that. It keeps moving while your personal disasters unfold privately. Warren Brandon asked. I realized I'd stopped responding. Sorry, I said softly. Old man brain. You were saying... Now listen carefully, because this next part matters. Pretending weakness around arrogant people is sometimes the fastest way to expose them. The moment Brandon believed I was confused or mentally slower, his guard dropped every single time. Well, he continued carefully, we just want to make sure the house stays secure long term. The house. Always the house. Not me, not family, not memories. The asset. That told me everything. After the call ended, I sat alone at the kitchen table for nearly 20 minutes without moving, just thinking and remembering. See, people think betrayal begins the moment you discover it. It doesn't. Betrayal begins much earlier, in small moments, tiny selfish decisions, little resentments left unspoken, greed slowly growing in silence like mold behind walls. Looking back, the signs had been there for years. Brandon constantly asking about property taxes, questions about refinancing, subtle comments about planning ahead. At the time, I thought he was being responsible. Now I realized he'd been studying the battlefield long before I noticed the war. Around 9:15, Sammy called. You still alive? He asked immediately. Physically, yes. Emotionally, debatable. That made him laugh. Good. I needed laughter right then. Even small laughter. Especially small laughter. We talked for almost an hour. About everything except the papers at first, football, arthritis medication commercials, why modern trucks cost more than houses did in 1989. Then finally, Sammy sighed. You know what bothers me most? Besides your cholesterol. Besides that. I leaned back in my chair, smiling faintly. Go ahead. The fact that Brandon thinks you're helpless now. That hit harder than I expected. Because helplessness terrifies men our age more than death sometimes. Not being needed. Not being respected. Becoming something people manage instead of listen to. I stared down at my hands resting on the kitchen table. Older hands now, veins more visible. Skin thinner, small scars from decades of work. But still steady. Very steady. I'm not helpless, I said quietly. I know that, Sammy replied immediately. You know that. Brandon's the idiot in this situation. Idiot might have been harsh, but not entirely inaccurate. Because Brandon had made one catastrophic mistake already. He let me see the paperwork before locking everything into place. That arrogance would cost him eventually. After the call, I walked upstairs slowly and opened the hallway closet. Inside sat 3 old storage boxes filled with archived financial records from my consulting years. Most people would have thrown them away years ago. Not me. Fraud investigators become accidental historians. We save everything. I carried the boxes downstairs one by one, while my knees protested loudly enough to qualify as sound effects. By 10:30 p.m., my dining room looked like a tax auditor's nightmare. Folders everywhere, sticky notes, legal pads, old case files. And right in the middle of it all sat the papers Brandon wanted signed, like a spider pretending to be harmless inside its own web. I started cross-referencing names: Margaret Cole, Harlow and Pike Financial Solutions, county transfer records. Then suddenly, there it was, a connection. Small, but dangerous. One of the financial consultants listed in archived records had worked a disputed elder asset transfer case 5 years earlier involving temporary competency restrictions almost identical to the wording in my documents. Same structure, same legal language, same manipulation strategy. My pulse slowed immediately, not from fear, from certainty. Because once patterns repeat, they stop being accidents. I leaned back slowly in my chair, staring at the ceiling fan spinning overhead. You sloppy, greedy little fool, I whispered. And honestly, part of me felt sad saying it. Because despite everything, Brandon was still someone I once taught how to drive. Still someone who used to sit at my kitchen counter eating cereal at midnight. Still someone Margaret loved deeply. That complicated the anger. Real family betrayal always does. Midnight came quietly. rain still falling outside. The house dark except for the dining room light above me. And sitting there surrounded by evidence, I realized something important. This was no longer just about protecting my home. It was about protecting my dignity, my independence, my right to decide my own future. Because once people start treating you like you're incapable, they rarely stop voluntarily. No, you have to stop them yourself, carefully, quietly, permanently. I gathered the papers into neat stacks again just as my phone buzzed one more time on the table. A text from Brandon. Need an answer tomorrow. I stared at those 4 words for a long moment. Then I smiled. Not because I was winning yet, but because pressure makes greedy people reckless. And reckless people leave evidence behind. Tomorrow I realized Brandon was finally going to push too hard. And when he did, I'd be ready. The next morning felt different. Heavier. You ever wake up already knowing the day is going to change something important? That was the feeling. I got out of bed at 5:58 a.m., 6 minutes earlier than usual. That alone should tell you how tense I was, because my body normally treated routine like federal law. Outside the rain had stopped, but the streets of Willow Creek Drive still glistened under the pale morning light. Everything looked clean, calm, which was ironic considering the storm sitting at my dining room table. I walked downstairs slowly, every stair creaking beneath me, like the house itself was warning me to pay attention. The old hardwood floors felt cold under my socks. I shuffled into the kitchen, started the coffee maker, and stared out the window while it brewed. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson was already outside watering flowers. She absolutely did not need to water after last night's rain. That woman watered plants the way some people apologize for emotional trauma, excessively and without solving anything. I smiled despite myself. Little moments like that matter. Because when family betrayal enters your life, humor becomes survival equipment. At exactly 7:14 a.m., my phone buzzed. Brandon, again. 4th call in less than 24 hours. Impatience was eating him alive now. I answered calmly. Morning, he replied quickly. Too quickly. Can we meet today? Margaret's coming by around noon. There it was, the escalation, lawyer involvement, pressure, timelines, classic manipulation strategy. I poured coffee into my chipped blue mug and leaned against the kitchen counter. Noon feels early. A pause. Then Brandon sighed. Not angry yet, but close. Warren, we're just trying to help you here. Help. Funny word. Funny how often people use it right before trying to take something from you. I'll be there, I said quietly. The relief in his voice came too fast. Good. Good. That's good. And immediately I knew something important. He needed today badly. Not wanted, needed. Big difference. After the call ended, I sat down at the kitchen table and opened the folder again. Same papers, same fake concern hidden beneath legal language. But this morning I noticed something else. A handwritten note in the margin near one signature line. Tiny, almost invisible. Expedite before review. I stared at those 3 words for nearly a full minute. Then I laughed. Not loudly, just one quiet little laugh from deep in my chest. Because there it was. Proof of panic. Proof somebody behind Brandon was nervous about scrutiny, and nervous people make mistakes. By 9 a.m., Sammy arrived carrying a cardboard tray with 2 coffees and a sausage biscuit that looked medically irresponsible. You look cheerful, he said suspiciously. I found something. That got his attention immediately. We sat at the dining room table together while I showed him the handwritten notation. Sammy adjusted his glasses and whistled softly. Well, he muttered, that's not subtle. Nope. You think Brandon wrote it? I shook my head slowly. No. Too organized. This feels like somebody used to pushing paperwork fast. Harlow and Pike. Probably. Sammy leaned back in his chair quietly. So what's the plan? Now pay attention here, because this next part matters. Revenge isn't about rage. Not real revenge. Real revenge is controlled exposure. You let dishonest people reveal themselves publicly while you remain calm enough to survive the fallout. That was my plan. No screaming, no threats, no dramatic speeches. Just patience and evidence. Around 11:40 a.m., I drove downtown toward Margaret Cole's office. in my old Explorer, while Sammy followed behind me in his faded red Chevy Silverado that sounded like loose silverware inside a dryer. The sky had turned bright blue after the storm. Downtown Des Moines looked strangely beautiful in the sunlight. Glass buildings reflecting morning light, people walking with coffee cups, businessmen pretending stress was a personality trait, normal life continuing again. Meanwhile, I was heading toward a meeting designed to quietly strip away control of my own life. Funny world. Margaret Cole's office sat on the third floor of a beige office building next to a dental practice and a failing insurance agency. The waiting room smelled like vanilla candles and legal debt. Margaret greeted me with the kind of smile people practice in mirrors. "Warren," she said warmly. "Good to see you." "No, it isn't," I replied pleasantly. Her smile twitched for half a second. Tiny crack. But I saw it. Brandon sat near the conference table, already flipping nervously through papers. Navy suit today, expensive watch, jaw tight. Pressure was wearing him down fast now. Good. Margaret motioned toward the chair. "Why don't we sit and finalize everything finalize? Such an innocent little word." I sat slowly, placing my reading glasses carefully on the table. Brandon immediately pushed the documents toward me like a gambler shoving chips into the center of a table before losing nerve. "We simplified a few things," he explained quickly. Of course they did. That's what manipulators always say right before making things more dangerous. I opened the folder calmly and immediately noticed another mistake. This one bigger, much bigger. One property appendix referenced an asset protection review that legally required independent medical evaluation before activation. Meaning, they'd prepared control documents before even establishing legal justification. Premature execution. Sloppy. Very sloppy. I looked up slowly at Brandon. "You seem nervous." Margaret answered before he could. "We're just trying to move efficiently." "No," I said calmly. "Efficient people don't make this many filing mistakes." Silence. Beautiful silence. You know that moment when people suddenly realize you're not as unaware as they hoped. That moment right there. Brandon shifted uncomfortably. "Warren." I raised one hand gently and stopped him completely. "Power isn't loud. Remember that." I flipped another page. Outdated county codes. Improper timestamp sequencing. Asset clauses missing mandatory review language. Margaret's face slowly tightened. Not panic yet, but concern. And Brandon. He looked like a teenager realizing the teacher actually collected the homework. "I spent 40 years investigating fraud," I said quietly. "Did either of you honestly believe I wouldn't read this carefully?" Nobody answered. Outside the conference room window, traffic moved slowly through downtown Des Moines, while inside the temperature in that room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Margaret finally cleared her throat. "These are minor technical issues." "No," I replied softly. "Minor technical issues don't include expedited authority transfers tied to competency restrictions." Brandon's eyes widened slightly. There it was. Fear. Finally. Because now he understood something he should have realized from the beginning. I wasn't confused. I wasn't weak. And I definitely wasn't signing anything. Margaret carefully folded her hands together. "Perhaps we should slow down and revisit the documentation process." Translation retreat. They wanted retreat. I almost admired it. Almost. But then Brandon made the mistake greed always pushes people into eventually. He lost patience. "This wouldn't even be necessary if you just cooperate for once," he snapped suddenly. The room went dead silent. And there it was. The truth finally stepping out from behind the mask. Not concern, control, not protection. Ownership. I looked at him for a very long moment, then quietly removed my glasses and smiled, because Brandon had finally shown me exactly who he was. The moment Brandon snapped at me, the entire room changed, not loudly, quietly, like the temperature dropping before a tornado hits the plains. Margaret Cole immediately turned toward him. "Brandon," she warned softly. "Too late. You can't put toothpaste back in the tube, and you definitely can't put truth back into someone's mouth once anger drags it out." Brandon leaned back in his chair hard enough to make the leather creak. His face had gone slightly pale beneath that carefully maintained businessman confidence. "Good. Pressure cracks masks. I folded my glasses carefully and placed them on the conference table. Deliberately slow, deliberately calm. And let me tell you something. Nothing terrifies dishonest people more than calm silence, because silence gives their own guilt room to speak. Outside the office window, downtown Des Moines traffic crawled past in the afternoon sunlight. Somewhere below us, a car horn blared. Somebody laughed on the sidewalk. Normal life continued while inside that conference room, Brandon realized the old man he thought he could manipulate was now staring directly through him. "You think I don't understand what this is?" I asked quietly. Nobody answered. Margaret shifted uncomfortably. Brandon looked down at the paperwork instead of at me. That alone told me everything. See, innocent people look you in the eye. Guilty people suddenly become fascinated by furniture. I leaned forward slightly. Temporary authority clauses. Competency language. Expedited transfer structures. You weren't trying to help me. Brandon finally looked up. "That's not fair." "No. You've been forgetting things lately." That one landed harder than I expected. Not because it was true, because it was cruel. You reach a certain age, and people start quietly auditing your humanity. Every misplaced key becomes evidence. Every repeated story becomes concern. Every tired moment gets treated like decline. And once somebody decides you're becoming incapable, they stop listening to you. I stared at Brandon for a long moment. "I forgot where I parked at Hy-Vee one time. You left your stove on last month. I was boiling eggs. You repeated the same story twice at Christmas." I blinked slowly. "You mean the story everybody interrupted before I finished silence again? But this silence felt uglier, more personal." Margaret finally stepped in carefully. "Maybe emotions are escalating unnecessarily here." That almost made me laugh. Unnecessarily. As if finding out your own family tried to quietly position you for legal control was some minor misunderstanding over potato salad recipes. I leaned back slowly in my chair. "You know what the funny part is?" Neither of them spoke. "The funny part is, I probably would have helped you if you'd just been honest." That hit Brandon visibly, because deep down, he knew it was true. I had helped him before, repeatedly. Business debt during COVID, mortgage payments after layoffs, medical bills when his wife needed surgery 3 years earlier. I never kept score. Family shouldn't feel transactional. At least that's what I used to believe. Brandon rubbed both hands over his face roughly. For the first time since this started, he stopped pretending to be polished. And honestly, that version of him looked exhausted. "You don't understand the situation," he muttered. There it was. Finally. The crack opening wider. I stayed quiet. Let him talk. That's another trick investigators learn. People reveal more when silence makes them uncomfortable. Margaret looked nervous now. Very nervous. "Brandon, maybe we should discuss this privately." "No," he snapped suddenly. "He deserves to know." Interesting. Very interesting. Because angry people stop protecting secrets carefully. Brandon stood up and paced toward the office window. His expensive shoes clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. "Harlow and Pike have been pressuring me for months," he admitted finally. "The business is underwater." I felt my stomach tighten slightly. Business. Of course. Greed rarely starts as greed. Usually it starts as desperation wearing greed's clothing. "What business?" I asked carefully. "My development project in West Glen." I closed my eyes briefly. The condos. 3 years earlier, Brandon had invested heavily into a luxury condo project near West Des Moines after convincing himself the housing market would explode upward forever. It didn't. Interest rates rose. Investors vanished. Construction stalled. And apparently Brandon had been drowning quietly ever since. I guaranteed loans against future assets, he admitted weakly. They needed collateral reassurances. The house. My house. Suddenly, the entire picture became horrifyingly clear. He hadn't just been trying to control me emotionally. He needed legal positioning tied to my estate to stabilize his collapsing financial situation. Sammy had been right. The audacity was unbelievable. Margaret stood quickly. I advised against rushing this process. That was a lie. Not a huge lie, but enough of one that I immediately noticed. Her left hand twitched when she said it. Tiny movement. People always leak truth physically before verbally. I looked directly at her. Did you? She froze. Another silence. Then Brandon laughed bitterly from across the room. No, she didn't. Well, that escalated quickly. You said we needed signatures before quarter-end reviews, he snapped at Margaret. You said this was manageable. Margaret's professional mask finally cracked slightly. I said it required sensitivity. You said he wouldn't notice. And there it was. The sentence. The real sentence. The one nobody in that room could take back. He wouldn't notice. I sat perfectly still after hearing that, not because I was shocked anymore, but because hearing your own value reduced to incompetence by people you trusted does something strange to your chest. It feels cold, hollow, quietly humiliating. But anger, no. The anger had already passed. What remained was clarity, pure, dangerous clarity. I stood up slowly from the conference table. My knees cracked loudly enough to interrupt the tension for half a second. Honestly, timing-wise, aging joints are deeply embarrassing. Even Sammy would have laughed at that one. I gathered the paperwork calmly into a neat stack while Brandon watched nervously. You know what your biggest mistake was? I asked quietly. He swallowed hard. What? You assumed aging means weakness. Nobody moved. I slid the documents into my leather folder carefully. I spent 40 years building fraud cases against people smarter than you. Brandon looked physically ill now. Good. Because consequences should feel real. I'm not signing anything, I continued calmly. And starting today, every communication regarding my property finances or estate goes through independent counsel. Margaret immediately spoke up. That's probably wise. Of course it was wise now. Funny how ethics suddenly reappear once exposure enters the room. Brandon stepped toward me desperately. Warren, wait, no. Just one word. Quiet, firm. Enough. He stopped immediately. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I realized something important. The balance of power had shifted completely. Because now Brandon wasn't dealing with a confused old man anymore. Now he was dealing with an investigator who finally understood the entire scheme. And worse for him, I had evidence. Lots of it. I walked toward the office door slowly, then paused with my hand resting on the handle. Without turning around, I said the sentence that finally made the room go completely silent. You should probably call your investors. A pause. Then I looked back at Brandon. Because if I can unravel this in 48 hours, I gave him a small, tired smile. Imagine what my business partner's going to do when she sees it. And suddenly, Brandon looked terrified for the very first time. I didn't have to wait long. The knock on the door came like fate itself had timed it perfectly. Warren, a calm voice called. I turned slowly, smiling faintly. Linda Carver. My old business partner and former colleague from the auditing firm stepped into the conference room with the kind of quiet authority only decades of experience can give. She was 66, wearing a gray tailored blazer and black slacks. Her hair streaked with silver framed a face that had seen enough deception to recognize it immediately. Brandon froze. I've seen many reactions in my time. Panic, anger, despair, confusion. But nothing compared to the subtle collapse of arrogance when your ally walks into the room and you realize your plan is about to fall apart. Linda didn't raise her voice. She didn't point fingers. She didn't need to. Her eyes sharp as a scalpel scanned the documents on the table, the folder in my hands, and then Brandon. Warren, she said quietly, you still doing it the old-fashioned way, I see. I smirked slightly. Some things never change. Brandon's mouth opened, opened again. He was trying to salvage the situation, trying to explain himself. You can't just... He started voice cracking slightly. Actually, Linda interrupted gently. I think he can. And he already has. I leaned back slightly, letting her words settle over Brandon like a fog. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. I took a sip of coffee and studied Brandon. Sweat had begun forming along his temples. His fingers fidgeted with the papers. Every line, every detail I'd studied meticulously now stood as evidence against him. You thought I wouldn't notice the discrepancies in the timestamps, I said softly. Brandon's eyes widened, and the improper competency clauses, the outdated county codes, and the misfiled signatures. He swallowed hard. Linda crossed her arms, her eyes never leaving him. Do you understand what this all means? Brandon shook his head, muttering something under his breath. I straightened the folder in my hands, the leather creaking slightly. It means I said that every action you took to control me was completely transparent to anyone who actually knows what they're looking at. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had assumed I was weak, I was retired, I was old. Yet here we were. He was the one trapped. Margaret Cole shifted in her seat, clearly trying to hide her own discomfort. Linda ignored her, focusing on the scene like a seasoned conductor guiding a symphony of chaos. You thought you could control me using fear, I continued. Using paperwork, using deadlines, using impatience. And yet, I let the pause linger. You're the one who's panicking now. Brandon's face went pale. The words I had spoken had already undermined his confidence. I set the folder down on the table, deliberately tapping it once. Do you see this? Every mistake, every rushed signature, every overlooked clause, it's all documented. Every single one of them. Linda nodded almost imperceptibly. Warren's right. You've overstepped. And now it's time to face the consequences. Brandon opened his mouth again, but no words came out. I could feel Sammy's presence behind me somewhere in the room's periphery, though I didn't need to see him to know he was silently approving. He had been my sounding board, my anchor through all of this. Without him, the plan would have been far more dangerous, far more emotionally draining. Brandon's hands shook slightly as he reached toward the papers. I held up a hand, stopping him. No, you touch nothing, you speak nothing, you just listen. It wasn't anger speaking, it was authority. Something Brandon had been denied for far too long: respect for the knowledge, patience, and experience of someone he had assumed was obsolete. Linda finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. We can't undo what's already been signed, but we can prevent any further damage, and that requires immediate reassessment of your authority over Warren's assets. Brandon slumped into his chair, a faint whimper escaping him. He had not anticipated this outcome. You really thought you could manipulate the situation without consequences, I said quietly. But greed always leaves footprints, and arrogance leaves a trail. The moment you underestimated me, the game was over. You just didn't realize it yet. He didn't respond, because he couldn't. Margaret Cole finally muttered, I should have double-checked the timeline. Linda's eyes narrowed slightly. You should have, but the responsibility ultimately lies with him. And you, she said, pointing ever so slightly at Brandon, need to reassess your approach before any further damage is done. I glanced at Brandon. Do you understand now? His lips pressed into a thin line, nodding slightly. Silent submission. That's when the moment truly settled in. The quiet revenge I had been cultivating, the patience, the observations, the careful planning, it all came together in that instant. Not a loud explosion, not a dramatic confrontation, just clarity, exposure. I didn't have to yell, threaten, or act irrationally. The evidence spoke. The truth spoke. And Brandon finally understood fully that he was on the losing side of this game. Warren Linda said gently, You should rest. You've done enough for one day. I nodded. I will. But someone needs to guide him through this lesson he just learned. Brandon didn't look up. He was still absorbing the weight of what had happened. I stepped toward the door, slowly letting the room settle into its new equilibrium. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The late afternoon sun cast golden light through the blinds, reflecting softly off the polished conference table. Everything looked calm again, ordinary. And yet nothing would ever feel ordinary to Brandon again, because the moment he believed he had the upper hand, it had quietly been taken from him. I walked past him, past Margaret, past Linda, and felt a rare sense of satisfaction. Quiet, controlled, complete. Sammy's voice echoed in my memory. Patience, observation, precision. And at that moment, I realized how true it was. You don't need fury to win, you need understanding. You need calm. And you need to know your enemy better than they know themselves. That's the art of quiet revenge. I didn't smile. Not broadly. Just a small, satisfied twist of the lips. The work wasn't over. Nothing involving family ever is. But for now, the scales had been balanced. Brandon sat in stunned silence. Margaret Cole looked remorseful. Linda Carver, composed as ever, simply nodded toward me. I folded my hands and waited. for the final moves, because patience had brought me this far, and patience would see me through the rest. The strange thing about winning is that sometimes it doesn't feel victorious at all. Sometimes it just feels quiet, heavy, like standing in the middle of a room after an argument ends and realizing nothing inside that room will ever feel the same again. That's how I felt driving home from Margaret Cole's office that evening. The sun was setting over Des Moines, painting the streets gold and orange, while my old Ford Explorer rattled softly at every red light like it was emotionally invested in the situation too. I drove slowly down Grand Avenue with both hands on the steering wheel, staring at traffic without really seeing it. Behind me, Brandon's world was collapsing, and somehow that didn't feel as satisfying as I thought it would. Don't get me wrong, part of me absolutely felt justified. The manipulative paperwork, the secret meetings, the assumption that I was too old to notice, that deserved consequences. But another part of me kept remembering smaller things. Brandon at 22 helping me shovel snow after Margaret's surgery. Brandon burning hamburgers so badly during a 4th of July cookout that Sammy called them beef charcoal. Brandon sitting at my kitchen table years ago asking for advice about marriage because he was scared of becoming a bad husband. People are complicated. That's the problem. It would be easier if villains were monsters all the time, but usually they're just flawed people who let desperation rot their judgment. By the time I pulled into Willow Creek Drive, the neighborhood looked peaceful again. Porch lights glowing, kids riding bikes near the corner stop sign, somebody grilling burgers somewhere nearby. Normal life. Always normal life, continuing around personal disasters. I sat inside the Explorer for almost a full minute before getting out. My hand stayed resting on the steering wheel while the engine ticked softly beneath the hood. You know that feeling when your adrenaline finally leaves your body? That exhaustion afterward. That's what hit me. Not physical exhaustion exactly, emotional exhaustion, the kind that settles into your bones. Inside the house, everything looked exactly the same. Margaret's blanket still folded on the couch, the fake decorative apples still sitting in the bowl, the same family photos lining the hallway walls. But now the house carried a different feeling. Awareness changes places. Once betrayal touches a home, the walls remember it somehow. I loosened my tie, walked into the kitchen, and immediately heard knocking at the back door. 3 sharp taps. Sammy. Of course. I opened the door and found him holding a greasy white paper bag from Miller's Diner down on Locust Street. Emergency pie delivery, he announced. I stared at him. You brought pie. You survive attempted legal imprisonment by your own family. You earn pie. Honestly, fair logic. We sat at the kitchen table eating slices of cherry pie while the evening news mumbled softly in the living room. And for 20 minutes, neither of us talked about Brandon. Instead, Sammy complained about gas prices, then about cholesterol medication commercials, then about how modern country music sounded like cowboys doing accounting homework emotionally. I laughed harder than I had in days. That mattered more than I realized at the time, because anger can consume you if you don't interrupt it occasionally with ordinary human moments. Finally, Sammy wiped his mouth with a napkin and looked at me seriously. So what happens now? Good question. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Linda's filing formal objections first thing tomorrow. Independent review freezes everything temporarily. And Brandon. I stared down at the pie crust crumbs on my plate. That depends on whether he learns from this. Sammy nodded quietly. You still care about him? I didn't answer immediately, because yes, that was the worst part. Despite everything, some stupid, stubborn part of me still cared. Family betrayal doesn't erase love instantly. It just poisons it slowly. Around 9:30 p.m., my phone buzzed again. Brandon. I considered ignoring it, really considered it. But eventually I answered. His voice sounded different immediately, smaller somehow. You home, he asked quietly. Obviously. A pause. Then, can I come over? Now stay with me here because this next part matters. There's a dangerous moment after someone hurts you where they suddenly become human again. And human pain is harder to hate than arrogance. 20 minutes later, Brandon sat across from me at the same kitchen table where this whole nightmare had started. Except now he looked exhausted, tie loosened, hair messy, eyes red around the edges. He looked less like a manipulative businessman and more like a scared little boy trapped inside adult consequences. I hated how much that affected me. He stared at the table for a long time before speaking. I messed up. Simple sentence. But honest. That mattered. You think I replied quietly? He nodded slowly. The project's failing worse than you realize. I stayed silent. Let him talk. The investors started panicking 3 months ago, he continued. Harlow and Pike suggested restructuring options. Then they started talking about estate positioning and asset leverage, and he rubbed both hands over his face tiredly, and I convinced myself it was temporary. There it was. The real tragedy underneath greed. Self-justification. Most people don't wake up trying to become villains. They just keep making smaller, selfish decisions until eventually they can't recognize themselves anymore. I wasn't trying to hurt you, Brandon whispered. That one almost made me angry again. Almost. Because intention doesn't erase betrayal. I need you to understand something I said quietly. You weren't trying to protect me. You were trying to control the outcome of your own mistakes. He looked down immediately because he knew I was right. Outside rain started falling again lightly against the windows. Iowa weather apparently believed subtle symbolism was necessary. Brandon finally looked back up at me. Are you going to sue me? Funny question. Not because it was ridiculous, because fear had finally replaced arrogance completely. I leaned back slowly. No. His eyes widened slightly. No. But you're done making decisions involving my property, my finances, or my future. He nodded immediately, too quickly. Fear does that. I studied him quietly across the kitchen table, and suddenly he looked older to me, not physically, emotionally, like consequences had finally reached him. You know what your biggest mistake was? I asked. He swallowed hard. Thinking you wouldn't notice, no. I shook my head slowly. Thinking desperation gave you permission. That one hit him hard. I could see it. Silence filled the kitchen again while rain tapped softly against the windows and the refrigerator hummed behind us. Ordinary sounds, but now attached to an extraordinary memory neither of us would ever forget. Eventually, Brandon stood slowly from the table. I'm sorry, Warren. Not Dad. Warren. That hurt more than I expected. I nodded once. I know. And strangely, I believed him. But belief doesn't rebuild trust instantly. That takes longer. Much longer. After he left, I locked the front door and stood alone in the hallway for a while, staring at the family photographs on the wall. So many birthdays, vacations, Christmas mornings, a lifetime of moments now carrying cracks through them. That's the real damage betrayal causes. Not financial. Emotional archaeology. It forces you to revisit old memories and question which parts were real. I turned off the hallway light slowly and headed toward the kitchen again. Tomorrow would bring lawyers, reviews, financial cleanup, consequences. But tonight the house was quiet again. And for the first time in days, so was my mind. Mostly. The strange part is, life kept going. That's what nobody tells you about family betrayal. You expect thunder, collapse, some dramatic ending where everybody changes overnight. But real life still expects you to buy groceries on Thursday morning. 3 days after everything exploded, I found myself standing inside a Hy-Vee supermarket comparing 2 brands of pasta sauce while emotionally recovering from attempted legal manipulation. That's adulthood in America, by the way. Trauma mixed with discount coupons. I stood there holding a jar of garlic marinara while an older woman nearby argued with her husband about yogurt prices like civilization depended on it. And suddenly, I started laughing quietly to myself. Not because anything was funny exactly, because life refusing to pause for heartbreak feels absurd sometimes. I bought groceries, filled my gas tank, picked up allergy medication, and all the while, part of my brain kept replaying everything Brandon had done. The paperwork, the lies, the panic in his eyes once he realized I understood the scheme. Funny thing is, anger fades faster than disappointment. Disappointment lingers, especially when it involves people you once trusted completely. By Friday afternoon, Linda Carver had officially frozen every questionable document tied to the estate review. Harlow and Pike immediately backed away the moment independent auditors became involved. Cowards usually do. You threaten exposure, and suddenly everybody remembers ethics again. Sammy called it corporate possum behavior. Play dead until consequences leave, he explained over breakfast at Miller's Diner. Honestly, pretty accurate. We sat in our usual booth near the front window while rain drizzled outside again because apparently Iowa weather had committed emotionally to symbolism this week. Sammy was eating pancakes aggressively enough to concern nearby witnesses. "You okay?" he asked eventually. I shrugged. "Depends what you mean by okay. That bad, huh?" I stirred my coffee slowly. I keep replaying things, like what I looked out the diner window toward the wet parking lot. Little moments. That's the dangerous thing after betrayal. Your brain becomes a detective against its own memories. Suddenly, every old conversation feels suspicious retroactively. Every favor feels transactional. Every kindness gets re-examined under harsher lighting. I hated that feeling, because bitterness is contagious once it gets inside you. And I didn't want to become one of those older men who spends every conversation talking about how humanity disappointed him. Nobody likes those guys. They always smell faintly like menthol and resentment. Sammy pointed his fork at me. "You know what your problem is. Besides cholesterol, you still think this means you failed somehow." That caught me off guard slightly. Because maybe he was right. Part of me did feel responsible. Maybe I ignored warning signs. Maybe I trusted too easily. Maybe grief after Margaret died made me emotionally softer than I realized. "You loved people," Sammy said quietly, like he could somehow read my thoughts. "That's not failure." I didn't answer immediately, because honestly I needed to hear that more than I wanted to admit. After breakfast, I drove aimlessly around Des Moines for nearly an hour. Sometimes thinking feels easier while moving. The city looked beautiful in that damp autumn light. Red brick buildings, wet sidewalks, trees turning orange along Ingersoll Avenue. Normal life everywhere. And slowly, I realized something important. Brandon's betrayal had shaken my trust, but it hadn't destroyed me. Big difference. Around 2 p.m., Brandon called again, not aggressively this time, cautiously. "Hey," he said quietly after I answered. "Hey." Long silence. Then finally I sold the BMW. That surprised me enough to laugh softly. Really needed liquidity. Liquidity. God help me, even his apologies sounded financial now. But underneath the awkward phrasing, I heard something else. Humility. Real humility this time. Not performance. He continued carefully. "I'm restructuring everything. Investors too." "Mm-hmm. And I wanted you to know I withdrew completely from the estate discussions. That part mattered. Not because it fixed things instantly, but because accountability always begins with surrendering control." We talked another few minutes awkwardly. Two men standing in the wreckage of trust trying to figure out whether rebuilding was even possible. Before hanging up, Brandon suddenly said something unexpected. "I kept thinking you were becoming weaker." I stayed quiet. And honestly, he continued softly, "I think I just wanted somebody else to carry my panic for me." There it was. The truth. Raw and ugly. Because desperation makes people selfish in strange ways, especially men. Especially proud men. After the call ended, I sat in my driveway for a while, staring at the house again. Willow Creek Drive looked peaceful in the late afternoon sunlight. A little boy rode past on a scooter wearing a Spider-Man helmet way too big for his head. Somebody nearby was grilling onions. Life continuing. Again. That's the recurring lesson, I guess. Pain feels permanent while you're inside it, but the world keeps nudging you forward anyway. That evening, Linda stopped by the house carrying a cardboard file box filled with finalized legal paperwork. Real paperwork this time. Ethical paperwork. The exciting kind. She sat at my kitchen table reviewing everything while I made coffee. "You know," she said, "eventually most people would have exploded emotionally during all this." I considered it briefly. "What stopped you?" I thought about that honestly for a moment, then smiled faintly. Experience. Because here's something nobody teaches younger people anymore. Emotional control is power, not suppression, not silence. Control. The ability to stay calm long enough to see clearly while everybody else loses perspective. That skill saved me. Linda sipped her coffee and shook her head. You always did enjoy catching arrogant people. I enjoy patterns I corrected. Same thing. Maybe she was right. Later that night after she left, I walked slowly through the house, turning off lights one room at a time. Living room, hallway, kitchen. The house felt peaceful again. Mostly. Not perfect. Never perfect. Because some damage doesn't disappear just because the immediate crisis ends. Trust rebuilds slowly, family wounds heal unevenly. And honestly, part of me still grieved the version of Brandon I thought existed before all this happened. That's the hidden loss nobody talks about. Not the money, not the legal stress, the loss of certainty. Still, as I stood in the hallway looking at old family photographs under the soft yellow light, I realized something else too. I survived it without becoming cruel. That mattered deeply to me. Because revenge has a dangerous edge to it. If you're not careful, it changes you permanently. I didn't want revenge to make me hard. I just wanted truth to protect me. And maybe that's the difference between bitterness and wisdom. One destroys you slowly. The other teaches you boundaries. I stood there quietly for another moment before finally turning off the hallway light. Tomorrow would come soon enough. More conversations, more consequences, more healing. But tonight, the house belonged to me again. And for the first time in weeks, it actually felt like home. The morning after the confrontation with Brandon felt deceptively calm. Sunlight spilled over Willow Creek Drive, glinting off puddles left from last night's rain. Birds chirped. Cars rolled slowly down the suburban street. Life in Des Moines carried on like nothing had changed. And yet inside my home, everything had changed. I sat at the kitchen table nursing a cup of black coffee, the same chipped blue mug I'd been using all week, while the stack of legal documents, now properly corrected and overseen by Linda Carver, lay neatly in front of me. The papers no longer represented control manipulation or betrayal. They were evidence of survival strategy and quiet justice. Sammy came in carrying a bag from Miller's Diner. Breakfast for the victor, he teased, handing me a sausage biscuit. More like breakfast for the patient, I replied. He grinned, sitting down across from me. You look calm, smug even. I smiled faintly. Not smug, content. Temporary contentment at least. Because here's the truth about revenge quiet, or otherwise it never truly feels complete. It's never a full victory. There's always something left unsettled. Brandon had been exposed, his legal maneuvers invalidated, his arrogance humbled, and yet he was still my family, my son-in-law in name, but more complicated in truth. That meant healing would take longer than legal corrections, longer than any stack of paperwork or audit. I went over everything one more time. Brandon's mistakes were clear. Harlow and Pike had retreated. Margaret Cole's complicity had been revealed, and I had learned everything I needed to turn his plan against him without ever raising my voice. Linda arrived later in the morning. She brought the finalized documents and a calm, reassuring presence that reminded me of why I trusted her with my life and my work for decades. Warren, she said softly, laying a folder in front of me. This is all set. Your authority, your house, your estate, it's all secured. He can't touch anything without full oversight now. I looked at her and nodded. Thank you, truly. I couldn't have managed this without you. She smiled faintly, her eyes sharp and knowing. You've always been meticulous. The difference this time is you finally let me see it. We laughed quietly, the kind of laughter that comes from relief rather than humor. Brandon eventually came by later that afternoon. He walked in slowly, unsure face, pale. He wasn't defiant anymore. He looked like a man realizing that patience, observation, and experience were forces he could never outmatch. He started. Paused. I understand now, Warren. I overstepped. I misjudged you. I shouldn't have tried to take control. I didn't interrupt him. I let him speak. Because acknowledgement, genuine acknowledgement, is the first step toward accountability. He continued quietly. I'll fix my mistakes. I'll step back. And I'll try to rebuild what I broke. That last part struck me. Rebuilding trust, rebuilding relationships. That's the hard part of revenge that nobody talks about. It's easy to win in legal terms, to show the evidence, to expose the mistakes. But mending the emotional damage, that's a lifelong effort. I nodded. Good. That's the right step. We didn't hug, we didn't shake hands, we simply acknowledged reality. That in itself felt monumental. Later, Sammy and I sat again at the Maple Bean Cafe, sipping coffee while the morning sun lit up the rain-soaked streets. He grinned. "You actually look peaceful." "I am," I said softly. "But only because I know the battle isn't over emotionally, just legally." Sammy nodded knowingly. "Fair enough. But you handled it beautifully. Quiet, patient. Like you said, revenge doesn't need drama, just precision." "Exactly." That night I walked through my home again. Every room, every photograph, every family memento. The house was intact, the furniture was the same, and yet it felt different. Not perfect, never perfect, but secure. And for now that was enough. I thought about Brandon, about his mistakes, his arrogance, his desperation, and about the part of him that remained human, the part that realized he had hurt people he cared about. That part mattered more than punishment, because real growth only comes when people see the consequences of their actions clearly. And now he would see them. The rest of the evening, Sammy and I talked quietly. About nothing in particular. Football. Old cases. Why Des Moines winters always feel colder than they should. Why pie tastes better after tension-filled weeks. Ordinary conversations. Small moments. They reminded me that life continues after betrayal, after revenge, after justice is quietly restored. It reminded me that even in the darkest moments, human connection, friends, allies, people who see you clearly remains the true anchor. And I realized another important truth. Some losses remain even after justice is done. Brandon's relationship with me was strained now. He had work to do before trust could be fully restored. That was a loss I couldn't immediately fix. But loss doesn't mean defeat. It means there's space for growth, for repair, for rebuilding if people choose to take the right steps. I sat in my favorite chair that evening, sipping coffee, watching the sunlight fade. The house was peaceful, calm. I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, because I had survived. I had protected myself, and I had done it without losing my principles. Justice had been served quietly, without drama, without spectacle. And that is sometimes the most satisfying form of revenge. Later, I sent Brandon a simple text. "Start rebuilding, one honest step at a time." He replied almost instantly, "I will." "Thank you, Warren." That was all he needed to say, because actions matter more than words. And I would be watching, carefully, patiently, because some lessons only sink in when you let consequences speak louder than anger. Betrayal and revenge are complicated. Sometimes people you trust make mistakes driven by greed, desperation, or impatience. Justice doesn't always need to be loud. It can be quiet, precise, and patient. True power lies in observing, waiting, and letting others reveal themselves through their own actions. And even when legal victories are secured, emotional repair takes time. Trust must be rebuilt slowly, and the scars of betrayal remain, serving as reminders of what matters most: clarity, patience, and human connection. Even in the darkest moments, moments of humor, friendship, and shared memory keep you grounded. Small acts, a conversation over coffee, a shared pie. Remembering someone's smile remind us that life continues and that even amidst chaos, kindness and understanding are essential. Sometimes the people you love fail you. Sometimes revenge feels necessary. But true wisdom comes from learning how to protect yourself while preserving your humanity. If this story meant something to you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever been in a situation like this? We read every single one, Shad. And as always, thank you for being a part of this.